Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to speak before this committee as part of your study on the Auditor General's report on SDTC. The release of the Auditor General's report in June concluded a 2-year effort I initiated to expose how SDTC's idealistic mission was co-opted by a group of corrupt executives, board members, and insiders within the clean tech ecosystem. All or some, there's a lot of speech here. Frankly, I'm embarrassed to be here because me being here is an indication that the systems that are set out to protect people don't work. That's the biggest issue here, and I'll continue on my speech, but I want to make it clear that I'm here not just for SDTC, but point out that this should not have taken a 2-year effort to get to this point. And even to this day, real accountability doesn't exist. The Auditor General's findings conclusively validated and vindicated every single one of the issues I initially raised. Within hours of the report's publication, the Minister dissolved SDTC, a clear indication of the severity of the misconduct. This decision should serve as further proof that SDTC was beyond repair, with corruption that was so badly ingrained that it rendered the organization unfixable. It also serves as the ultimate indictment against SDTC's leadership, who continue to work today. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Office of the Auditor General for its dedication to this inquiry and their wider efforts as one of the few independent institutions in Canada that continue to uphold public trust in a system that has become increasingly opaque and unjust. And just as I was always confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement at SDTC, I remain equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization. Again, I accepted this invitation to come to this committee because I'd like to talk about the actual effort that was required to get to this point and what the continued lack of action by the federal government indicates about our society. Because the real issues extend beyond SDTC's collapse. The true failure of the situation stands at the feet of our current government, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up their findings over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. It should never have taken 2 years for the issues to reach this point, and what should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed SDTC to continue wasting millions of dollars and abusing countless employees over the last year. The first government official that I approached was the Liberal Member of Parliament for Calgary Skyview, George Chahal, at an SDTC event all the way back in May of 2022. He assured me that he took this situation seriously and guaranteed that he would facilitate contact with the appropriate people in the federal government and the Auditor General's office. His subsequent refusal to engage forced us to spend the next 5 months trying and failing to contact various agencies, including ISED, the Ethics Commissioner, as well as the Public Integrity Commissioner, to name just a few. It was only in December 2022 that I finally contacted the Auditor General's office, which set off a chain of events that finally culminated in the report in June. It took almost a full year after we initially talked to the MP that this file eventually ended up at ISED, who then hired RCGT in March 2023 to conduct a fact-finding exercise. This fact-finding was supposed to be a 6-week exercise with a simple goal to just validate the documentations that I had provided, with a stated guarantee that subsequent investigations involving the AG, ISED, and the RCMP would be initiated if any of those documents and allegations were proven true. By May 2023, ISED had already confirmed most of those allegations. RCGT had even drafted a report and provided a debrief to myself. with ISED bureaucrats stating their plan to make a recommendation to the minister and PCO that the report be released and that at least 4 separate investigations be initiated and managed through a newly created office within ISED. All of this should have led to immediate action, but once those findings reached the Privy Council office and the minister's office, everything changed. The investigation was delayed for another 4 months, allowing SDTC to continue misusing funds and mistreat employees, where at this point the federal government had in fact known that this was true. By late August, ISED now confirmed that no further investigations were required, and instead there were plans to release the report, suspend SDTC, and remove the board and executive team immediately. This was the outcome I was expecting, and I was satisfied that this situation was finally going to be resolved. Yet the minister and the government didn't act. ISED manipulated the findings, withheld the report from the public, and only suspended SDTC on a temporary basis with no plans to act against any single one of the wrongdoers, despite having overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The minister himself defended his inaction, stating that RCGT's report was inconclusive, but if anyone read the legal disclaimers that RCGT themselves had written in the reports, it would actually state the contrary. The report explicitly stated that none of the findings and work done by RCGT could actually be used to prove or disprove misconduct. This delay and lack of action again let SDTC continue operations unchecked and continue them to allow misuse of taxpayer dollars. At this point, the AG's office informed me of their decision to act, and in response, I made the decision to whistleblow a second time, this time publicly releasing recordings that expose ISED's deliberate inactions and falsehoods. The fact that I had to act again speaks volumes about the depth of corruption, not just within SDTC, but within the government and bureaucracy. The government's failure to act promptly or transparently is not just a bureaucratic failure, it is a moral one. These revelations triggered further inquiries.
Excuse me, Mr. Witness, I'm going to have to stop you there because I think that's a good point. You're a little over your time, and I'm sure the members are going to have additional questions for you. So
the areas I'd like to explore is around the former chair, Annette Verschuren, and her desire to get money from SDTC to the Verschuren Center at Cape Breton University. And I believe in a memo or an email that was written to Jennifer Smith from then VP of Investments, Zayed Rahim, who's now the acting president. He emailed her and said, I quote, Jen, this project is approved for fast track to the VCS, the committee, the analysis committee. Why would something be fast-tracked, and how would that happen?
In usual cases, we would fast-track applications that we clearly could see met all of the requirements for SDTC. I appreciate that you pointed this out because, we've had a lot of board members and executives speak to these issues as simple mistakes of, everything was just, we forgot to recuse ourselves, and that was it. But examples like that are what actually proves the intent, because one of the clearest ways to actually show what was happening is the potential of how they were brought into the organization and the preferential treatment that was given to these projects. So for the Verschuren Center's application, there's no logic that anyone in the public could believe that this wasn't preferential treatment, because for the ecosystem stream of funding, that wasn't publicly known to anyone. So the public, who should have the ability to apply to something like the ecosystem fund, couldn't apply to it, yet she was getting fast-tracked.
I appreciate that. I've got limited time. Then on January 18th, the same vice president sent a note to someone named Beth saying it was rejected because of conflicts, and saying that we will help find funding from other avenues in government for that project. Did SDTC staff help Annette Verschuren find funding for this project and other projects from the government? As an example, $50 million went to Annette Verschuren's NR store from Natural Resources and $170 million from the Infrastructure Bank. And on top of that, the Verschuren Center got a total of about $6.6 million anyway from ACOA, ISED, and other programs. Were SDTC staff involved in helping her get government money from other departments?
They were, and that's something that SDTC employees aren't supposed to be doing. If an application gets rejected, you reject it and you point them to other organizations, but SDTC employees are not expected to actually go out of their way and spend their own time to actually help an organization get funding. So that was completely out of the realms of their regular day-to-day business, and it happened multiple times, not just the Verschuren Center.
So ACOA gave the Verschuren Center June 9th, 2022, $2 million, then again gave them another $4.2 million a little later on from ACOA. Then ISED gave the center $1 million, another $1 million, bringing that to about $5.2 million. And then the Verschuren Center got another $3.1 million from the ISED department. So it looks like the Verschuren Center got over about $10 million itself, and then another $220 million for our other projects from government departments. And she was using ISED or SDTC, the Green Slush Fund staff, to help get her projects money from the government?
Not for all of them. Again, this is just that one situation where after she was rejected, SDTC employees were asked, but you've also missed a couple more million because there's another entity called NGen, which ISED funds, that then indirectly funded the Verschuren Center. And one of the things I'd like to point out is there are almost 3 or 4 different public announcements announcing the Verschuren Center getting funding, and every single one of them announced the same exact project, even though that project and the outcomes of that project have already been completed and funded 3 times over by various federal agencies.
And the Ethics Commissioner found her to have breached the Conflict of Interest Act twice, he said in his report. But in committee this week, it turned out under questioning that he actually said it was 24 times in his, but he didn't have any of these projects in it. So clearly, Annette Verschuren's conflicts with SDTC were way more than 24, as were other directors like Guy Humet, André-Lise METHOT, Stephen Kukucher, the list goes on. In fact, the Auditor General identified 9 directors in conflicts that did 186 conflicts out of 226 transactions. Was that your experience, that over 80% of transactions were conflicted with the board directors?
I never did the math, but there wasn't a single project review committee or board approval that didn't have at least 1 or 2 projects that were directly connected to board members. And for the majority of the time, employees weren't actually told about these conflicts. This was all only known at the board level, and you would only find out after the fact, and this is why I mentioned the additional help that was provided at these projects on the front end and the preferential treatment, because for the most part, none of this was known to us, but you can look back at it and say, oh, that was why they got preferential treatment relative to others.
Thank you. That is the time. Mr. Bradford, you have the floor.
So I'm going to ask you a set of questions. If you could be brief in your reply so we can get through them. You'll note the rounds of questioning are shorter now, sir. What funding streams violated the contribution agreement between Sustainable Development Technology Canada and the government?
All of them. The seed funding stream, the ecosystem funding stream, the startup funding stream, and the scale-up funding stream. I would mention that every single one of the seed funding projects did not meet any of the requirements, as did none of the ecosystem projects.
How much money passed through those streams?
I think it was over $50 million at least, but I think from the major findings, it has to be over $100 million.
Were many of the companies getting funding through these ineligible streams conflicted and connected to political appointees, Liberal appointed board members?
I would assume so. I think anyone who would be appointed through the GIC process would effectively be appointed by the Liberal Party.
Are you aware of any new contribution agreements being made since the Auditor General report came out?
There has been an updated contribution agreement which now effectively goes back and retroactively allows for the majority of those ineligible projects to be considered eligible.
So companies that were in conflicts before or ineligible, they've retroactively made them eligible?
Through the update to the contribution agreement, yes, they would be considered eligible.
That seems highly inappropriate, to say the least. Which of the Liberal-appointed board members benefited the most from what we know to be $330 million tax dollars given out in identified conflicts of interest?
I would say the one that was most benefiting was Andre Lee's METHOT, because for her, like, she worked at Cycle Capital and she had multiple companies within the SDTC portfolio. So for her, it wasn't a simple one company situation like Annette Verschuren. For Andre Lee's, you know, she was very friendly with the CEO at SDTC, and there were multiple instances where it wasn't just that she got preferential treatment for projects. She was getting funding 2 or 3 times where, you know, your project gets funding and it's technically graduated, and then it would come back into the fund and get an additional round of funding, and it might happen a 3rd time. So SDTC was effectively subsidizing companies for certain board members for years and years.
Has the board of SDTC met to approve more money being given out?
I believe that there has been a project review committee meeting with the new board which approved a new slate of projects to be funded this last week, I believe.
Are any of them conflicted?
I don't know.
So Trudeau's minister, Champagne, likes to exclaim quite loudly that he took action on the very moment that he heard about the problems at Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Is that true?
I would disagree with that.
Because the same conflicted companies then are still getting paid now. Is that right?
Exactly. You know, the findings that were the findings used to suspend SDTC were known to the federal government all the way back in May of 2023. There was a 5-month period during which the minister's office and PMO knew that there was a significant level of conflicts of interest and a significant issue on ineligible projects. And during those 5 months, they did nothing to stop. And even after they suspended SDTC, the projects that were noted to have broken conflicts and were ineligible were still given funding even after SDTC was suspended.
Right. So we've heard, and we understand it, I believe it to be true, that the quote-unquote new SDTC is the exact same as the old one. And, you know, I don't have any confidence that things have improved since the Auditor General's report. You know, the interim board is now effectively in charge of its own oversight. Should we be concerned about how many more millions are being doled out improperly in the coming 6 months?
Absolutely. I think the biggest risk I see with the situation is the fact that SDTC is going to hire their own consultants to review how they've fixed the situation. You know, I think they've mentioned hiring Deloitte to review how they've fixed the eligibility issues and conflicts. But again, I think we can all agree that none of the executives should have any say in what they've done and then have an ability to try and fix the situation. And Deloitte itself, you know, any of these consulting companies, if we're being serious here, you can pay them to say anything. So if they get paid enough by SDTC to say that, hey, everything is good, they will do it, just like Osler did for SDTC when their board investigated themselves and exonerated themselves in direct opposition to even the RCGT report.
Thank you very much. Out of the time, Ms. Brad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witness, for your attendance today. Thank you for your courage and bravery in coming forward and exposing the systemic corruption with this failed Liberal government. Canadians, thank you. I personally thank you. Now, I want to start by focusing in on lies. You referenced George Chahal, either lying directly to you or lying to Canadians, Liberal MP from Calgary. You've also made claims that Minister Champagne has deliberately misled, or in your words, lied to Canadians and lied to committee. You referenced in a recent post that there was an egregious cover-up over allegations of mismanagement and misconduct by SDTC. In essence, your position is that the minister and his office softened the final report of an investigation into governance and conflicts of interest at SDTC to protect Justin Trudeau's hand-picked conflicted chair, Annette Verschuren. So I take it that you're referencing two avenues of deliberate deceit by Minister Champagne. One in relation to the report when it was received, and your allegation, sir, that it was manipulated, or in your words, softened, and actually the timing by which he shared the news with Canadians that he took action. Am I accurate in that assessment?
You're accurate, and I would, I'd mentioned that there's a lot of public interest in this current parliamentary session with the potential of a vote of no confidence, and I would say that the real vote of no confidence against the Liberal Party happened when the Auditor General made a decision to intervene, because the Auditor General was the one that actually referenced the situation to PCO, and I said because the AG's office thought that this was a very simple situation to address.
Sure.
And when the ISED minister decided to not act, that is when the AG's office intervened. That in itself is a bigger vote of no confidence against the government than anything else.
Sure. And Minister Champagne has proudly on numerous occasions talked about how efficiently he acted, displaying transparency and accountability to Canadians. You're claiming the complete opposite, that he took the report, manipulated the report, softened the language, and then delayed doing anything to protect the insiders that were currently governing SDTC. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it's correct. It's any ruling party would not want this on their plate, so there's an obvious reason for why nothing happened.
Okay, so I'll stop you right there. With respect to the 37 hours of recordings with the Assistant Deputy Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, the chain of command with respect to communication at that level, the Assistant Deputy Minister reports to the Deputy Minister of ISED, who then reports to Minister Champagne. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you shared months and months of concerns, 300 pages of concerns laid out regarding allegations of mismanagement and human resource issues. You shared that. You shared that with the ADM, and I'm now telling you that likely the ADM most assuredly transferred that knowledge to the Deputy Minister, who transferred that knowledge to Minister Champagne, and no one did anything until the fall of 2023. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions. I do. My apologies, Chair. I have 30 seconds.
You have 30 seconds.
Would you table, sir, you referenced the 37 hours of transcripts of the ISED conversations with the ADM. Will you table those transcripts with this committee, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Those are the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You stated in your testimony that the minister lied when he said he was first briefed about the RCGT fact-finding report. At committee, the minister was very clear that he first learned about wrongdoing, conflicts, and mismanagement at SDTC. But that would not be correct, would it?
Probably not. Again, what did George Chahal say to him? You have to ask him.
You referenced that there was an interim RCGT report that contained many of the findings that ultimately made its way into the RCGT report that was issued in October. The interim report was written in May, and that the department was going to undertake or establish a directorate to undertake a series of investigations. I presume the minister would have been briefed in or around May about that interim RCGT report. Is that correct?
Correct. And the recordings showed that the deputy minister and the ADM had plans to speak to the minister around the findings, at which point the following week everything suddenly changed and now they needed more time and expansion of timing. I would say I myself was personally given the full verbal debrief by RCGT over a 2-hour period on exactly what the findings were at that point. So again, I think I maybe want to mention that the 37 hours that I'm talking about, this isn't, they integrated me into every aspect of the investigation. I don't know why, but they did.
Okay.
So the information I'm providing,
Okay.
I'm factually telling the truth
Well,
because it's all validated.
thank you, because the minister never mentioned anything about an interim report. He never mentioned anything about being briefed in May or June. He led a parliamentary committee to believe that he first learned about the findings of wrongdoing in September, and you said a year ago, or nearly a year ago, that he lied, and I presume it was in that context that you said he lied. Is that correct?
At that part and the part about the fact that he said he had no no say in that final recommendation. But again, there's evidence to the contrary showing that before he was actually given the recommendation, him and his office had actual verbal conversations with the ADM and the deputy minister to ask for changes on those reports and the recommendation prior to its official submission. And I would also say that the most indicative aspect of the situation that I said and the cover-up is the fact that the deputy minister is actually retiring.
So, in short, the minister was in the thick of it. He was actively involved. He was learning about information around wrongdoing. He was being briefed, and he was actively, along with his deputy minister, involved in saying, we want to change this, we want to change that, we want to soften the report throughout until it was released in October. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
That's fair, and it's not just the minister, it's PCO and the Department of Justice, because again, there were implications immediately when the investigation started in March because these were PCO appointees.
Who in PCO and Justice was involved in this corrupt editing process along with the minister?
ADMs?
ADM Noseworthy?
No, he wasn't involved in any investigation because he was implicated. What I meant was ADMs and people of that level as counterparts to the people at ISED were involved from day one.
Would it be fair to characterize that the conduct of the minister was corrupt?
Yeah. I mean, embarrassing at minimum.
Deceitful?
Yeah.
You also said last year and today that there was a consensus amongst bureaucrats at ISED that the board needed to go. But that changed when the minister intervened. Why did Minister Champagne go against the advice of his officials and politically interfere to keep the SDTC board, the conflicted board that had doled out hundreds of millions of dollars improperly, to keep that board in place? Why?
Because I think that the current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like SDTC in the public sphere.
Thank you very much, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, you mentioned the Mercer report on compensation and that it was altered. If you have copies of both of those, can you table those?
I don't have copies, but I can provide. again, people have to be taken out of their NDAs to provide evidence of that happening, but there are executives and other
Okay,
employees
I'll ask the committee, if the committee with consent will ask for the tabling of those documents with the committee, please. Thank you. Mr. Chair.
You have 4 minutes, 20 seconds.
Thank you. You mentioned the meetings. ADM Noseworthy was in all the meetings where the investments were decided. Now, the Auditor General found 82% of her selection were conflicted. My understanding is that those meetings started off with the recitation of which directors were conflicted with which project. Is that correct?
Correct.
So they briefed all the board members or all the investment committee members about which director was conflicted with which before they said, now we're going to vote on Jake's project. So they all knew whose project it was. Awfully convenient. Maybe that's how 82% got.
So I would also mention that, you know, when the ex-chair was at committee, I think on Monday, she mentioned that, you know, irregardless of the lack of recusals, there was a full and thorough review done by the board members on every single project, which is also a lie because at that point in time, SDTC was doing bulk approvals of projects. So you would present maybe 4 or 5 projects to the committee. The rest of the 7 or 10 projects would get approved automatically as long as no one had a question about it. So the board and the project review committee that, again, had the fiduciary obligation to approve it, they would not actually even review the projects that in many cases were conflicted by board members.
Okay, so Ms. Verschuren claimed, was there anything else in her testimony that you thought was not truthful to the committee?
I think another thing to mention is when we're talking about the COVID payments that existed, one of the things that continues to not be described is the context of what happened because board members had actually agreed to not provide a second COVID payment in October of 2020.
Okay, well, we're going to come to the COVID payments if we could, since I have short time and a couple of other questions. Other directors, you mentioned André-Lise METHOT, who was a beneficiary of this. She actually left the SDTC board and went to the Infrastructure Bank board. The Liberals appointed her there, and then she was part of the team that approved $170 million for the chair of the SDTC board's project. But when I go through some of these things, it's sort of, while her time was on the board, are you aware of Enekerm, Alberta, Biofuels, MindSense, Spark Microsystems, Concentric Agriculture, Polystyrivariant? There's about 20 or 30 companies here that Ms. METHOT had financial interest in through Cycle Capital. While she was on the board, they received $114 million, it seems, by my calculations. So was this part of the problem that's going on? You get, as André-Lise METHOT got $117 million, and she goes to the Infrastructure Bank and helps out her friend who got her this?
Correct. I think the board members and a lot of public, there's this excuse that continues to be perpetuated that this is a small industry and we cannot find anyone else within this small industry that has this technical expertise to approve projects. That's a false narrative. There are thousands of people. Canada's a huge country. They had the right people. They could find the right people to not have conflicts, but that didn't happen. They purposefully allowed.
There's no way
all
these
people with
few
conflicts.
board members represented 82% of the green technology industry in Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, the issue is they are at the front of the line, not just at SDTC, at all these other organizations, BDC, EDC, the Infrastructure Bank. They are friendly with everyone there, and their companies get money from SDTC. Then they go to the next organization using the approvals and due diligence from SDTC, and they continue going, and it's this perpetual cycle where it's funding from Crown Corporation's government that continues.
So do you think the Auditor General only did 228 of over 400 transactions in the audit period and identified 390 million of 800 million that was inappropriately allocated to directors' conflicts of interest and outside the con? Do you think the rest of those transactions, the other 200 or so, represent the same amount? So could we possibly be dealing with about 700 million, maybe 800 million almost, of money that was conflicted?
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. I'll allow the witness to answer.
I don't think so. Again, I would have to look at the projects and to see what that
Thank you.
looks like.
There was another thing as well, before I get into this. We were also looking for in addition to the recordings, there's still an interest here to get copies of the historic contribution agreements, as well as the updated, I understand there's some policy changes, there's an updated contribution agreement. Are you able to provide both of those agreements as well?
I think so. I think maybe I don't know if I have the most ratified one for the most updated, but I can provide contribution agreements like 6, 7, 8, and 9, the ones that would be relevant to the time period that we're talking about.
Can the committee produce that in the production of documents? Okay, just, has anybody been fired in the bureaucracy? After everything that's been discussed here, has anybody been fired?
I think there's been a lot of convenient retirements.
That's an interesting way of putting it. You know, this is really, I heard my colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's call it a culture of corruption. It's actually next level corruption with adrenaline shots and then steroids to follow that. This is the worst scandal I've seen in my time here. One of the questions I have is with the contribution agreements, like provincially I was a minister, if we wanted to spend outside the threshold, I know this is different, but we would have to go to the Executive Council and then we could maybe spend more if that was something that the government was going to do. Doesn't Parliament have to approve spending outside of what the contribution agreements lay out?
I think with regards to maybe some of those payments or things, SDTC was always below the targeted spending that gave the executives their bonuses. So a lot of these approvals were made to offset what was still available to them under the contribution agreement. So let's say you had a target to spend, because again, the incentive structures at SDTC were based on how much money you spent and how fast you sent it out, not how effectively you used it. And in certain cases, when you didn't meet that target threshold that you needed, you would then provide some level of, automated funding or something like these COVID payments to meet the amount that
Yeah.
you were technically available to give out.
But $58 million was spent by the board outside of the contribution agreements, which to me seems like illegal behavior by the board. But I would assume that only Parliament could approve spending estimates. That's where I was curious on that.
Potentially. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, me neither. So, next question. The minister claims the department became aware of mismanaged conflict at the start of the year in 2023, but it's potentially apparent that the minister could have become aware as early as May 2022 based on audio recordings. In your assessment, how likely is it that the minister was more than aware much before early of 2023?
I think it's unlikely. I think George Chahal's just lying, honestly. But I would assume, from some of the conversations I had within that ISED investigation, there were indications that there had been other problems previously reported to ISED as it pertains to SDTC or its executives or board. So there is the possibility that there was something that was potentially known to ISED prior to this situation, but maybe nothing as specific to the situation that we're talking about right now.
So essentially what you're saying, though, is the ADM who was privy to all of it, I don't remember the individual's surname at this moment, but that ADM would have had to brief the deputy minister, and it's the deputy minister's responsibility to brief the minister. That's a lot of time going by. It seems very unlikely that the minister wasn't aware.
Correct.
Do you believe he was aware? Outside of George Chahal, just what do you believe? Do you believe the minister was aware that this was all going on?
I believe that during the time at which that March 2023 to October, he was aware of the situation the whole time. He was not just given an awareness at March and then he conveniently forgot about the situation for 8 months up until the point, because again, within the context of the conversation that occurred, one of the things that was continuously explained to myself was the fact that there was always this political pressure on the ADM and the deputy minister to give updates and provide, some sort of an end of this investigation. So the only reason that would happen is if there was a continuous conversation back and forth about the situation.
Thank you very much. That is the time.
You've made some pretty serious claims about the work of McCarthy's, and I'm just curious, do you believe that they're trying to participate in a cover-up with the work that they're doing in this report?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, no further questions.
The floor for 5 minutes, please. This will be your side's last slot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During this so-called cleanup period at SDTC, updated contribution agreements have been completed. You indicated in your testimony that the effect of these contribution agreements is to make retroactive what were previously ineligible or conflicted projects eligible. To be clear, these contribution agreements, these updated contribution agreements, are prepared by ICIT. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they would have to be signed off by the minister, Minister Champagne, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you for that. Astounding. The Auditor General found, turning to COVID relief bonuses and payments, the Auditor General found that the SDTC board improperly approved $38.5 million in so-called COVID relief payments. In addition, the Auditor General found that in blatant conflicts of interest, board members voted to funnel millions of dollars of these payments into their own companies 63 times, 63 conflicts of interest, and the SDTC board chair, Annette Verschuren, was found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act by the Ethics Commissioner for funneling nearly $220,000 of these payments into her own company. These payments were approved days before the end of fiscal year 2019-20 and 2020-21, correct?
Correct.
Is it correct that board members and executives were incentivized with bonuses if SDTC met certain funding goals in a fiscal year, in other words, getting money out the door?
Correct.
I would note that immediately prior to the approval of the so-called COVID relief payments in both fiscal years, SDTC had fallen short of meeting its funding goals. Is it fair to say that this nearly $40 million improper COVID giveaway had an impact on bonuses that board members received?
Can I say more than just correct?
Yes.
A lot of this COVID relief payments, it's not just a conflict of interest. They could have approved this payment and that would have just it would have provided more of the funding that was already pre-approved. So all you were doing was adding in 5% that was already provided. For these COVID payments, they added additional 5%. So this is where they went above and beyond the logic of what you should have been doing, because even if the companies had a problem, you could have just provided them more of what was provided already, but instead they chose to add additional components of funding that never met any eligibility.
Right. And did that impact their bonuses?
Exactly.
Yes.
It impacted their bonuses.
So essentially, let me just clarify, if you would agree, board members voted to improperly funnel money out the door, including into their own companies, so that they could then turn around and pad their pockets with even more money in the way of bonuses. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
For the case of Annette Verschuren's Enerstore in that second COVID payment, in the same few days that she received that second COVID payment, her company was already in the process of getting over $200,000 as part of the regular SDTC process. So again, this is a question of knowing better, not just illegally approving funding.
Now, Annette Verschuren at committee has attempted to justify these improper and conflict-ridden payments on the basis that companies within SDTC's portfolio were badly struggling during COVID and needed emergency funding to survive. But that's not accurate, is it?
SDTC actually did a complete survey of the whole portfolio, which showed that the majority of companies didn't require additional funding, including the majority of the board members' companies. which is why they then went ahead and approved it for everyone, because had they done a more effective job, it wouldn't have given the majority of SDTC companies and the board members' companies any money.
How much time?
About 45 seconds.
Okay. I just want to turn very quickly to Ed Vandenberg. He was provided counsel to the SDTC board, notwithstanding the fact that he was a member of the council. Is that correct?
Correct, and he's also conveniently retired.
And he was being remunerated, right?
Correct.
And that would be in violation of the SDTC Act.
Correct.
Did Annette Verschuren know of that?
She did.
And what about the Assistant Deputy Minister Noseworthy?
They would all know this.
And presumably Minister Champagne would have known of it as well.
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.